Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'd like to talk to you about gas exchange. Yeah, that's part of the respiratory system's main function. You know, part of the thing about the respiratory system, it's not only to get oxygen and to release carbon dioxide. Other associative functions of the respiratory system is to transport that air in and out of the lungs and to warm it, to humidify it, and to filter it. But this particular video, I want to get into the details of gas exchange because I think that's really at the heart of the matter. You know, when you consider the massive, and I really mean this, the massive surface area of the lungs, it's simply staggering. When you consider that the respiratory system is kind of like an upside down tree, and it terminates in the lungs and these terminal bronchioles, and they manifest into these air sacs called alveolar air sacs. And these alveolar air sacs are really remarkable because if you can see here, the respiratory membrane is made up of the thinnest possible cells. They're called simple squamous, which maximize the diffusion of gas between the air sac and the capillary, which is the smallest of all blood vessels. And then likewise, the capillary itself is made up of simple squamous, and so diffusion of gases happens very, very readily. And so that's what this video is all about. Here's a light micrograph of the process that I was just describing. And so if I were to animate this a little bit, when you talk about oxygen gas, like that O2, oxygen gas in high concentration in the alveolar air sac when you inhale is simply going to diffuse into the capillary, and it's going to be picked up by red blood cells. And that's one of the things that I want to discuss today, is how red blood cells actually go about carrying oxygen. That's kind of interesting. And then likewise, carbon dioxide, which is present in the blood, is then released back into the air sac. And so CO2 goes into the air sac, and then we breathe that back out. And so all this occurs across the simple squamous epithelia. And so that's kind of neat. And so let's take a look at this. This is a most incredible. I'm always at awe of these scanning electron micrographs. It really shows what's happening. You can see inside the air sac. So it's literally a three-dimensional structure, these thin, simple squamous cells. And this is where this is literally the respiratory membrane where gas exchange occurs between the alveolar air sac and the capillary itself. And so gases are traveling, boom, back and forth, and this is constantly happening while we're breathing and while you're watching this video, I might add. And so here's a picture of this process here. You can look here's the alveolar and then air sac, and then look at this simple squamous cell right there. It's very thin and flat, and picture it like a pancake. I know this is sort of a cross section, if you will, but picture a pancake folded over to form like a ball. And so this is coming around, but if you had that, you wouldn't be able to see it. So, you know, what's going on inside the air sac other than oxygen? Well, and carbon dioxide. Well, you know, the thing about the respiratory system is that it tries very, very hard to prevent dust and microorganisms from reaching the lungs, but sometimes it gets past all of that mucus. And if germs ever made it to the alveolar air sac, guess what? Inside, that's right, inside the alveolar air sac, there's macrophages, which is a type of white blood cell that's going to gobble up bacteria. That's pretty awesome. So they reside inside. You're like, well, what are they doing inside here? Well, you know, white blood cells can occur in the blood, obviously, but they can ooze out of the capillary, and they can be in the tissue fluid as well. I mean, in the extracellular matrix out here, but they can also come into the alveolar air sacs to fight off germs. And then this is a cool cell too. This is something called the surfactant secreting cell. This cell produces a lipid-like solution called surfactant that coats the inside of the air sac. And as you may know, a lipid is hydrophobic, and it disrupts water's ability to hydrogen bond with itself. There's so much mucus inside and so much fluid inside the air sac that the surface tension created by the hydrogen bonds would literally collapse the air sacs. And so in order to make sure that the air sacs were fully inflated, the surfactant, this lipid, interferes with the hydrogen bonding, and therefore the alveolar air sac is fully open. Now, what's kind of interesting, a side note, is that surfactant's really important, and these cells are sometimes in a newborn, premature newborn infant. Sometimes surfactant is lacking in the newborn's lungs, and so this needs to be administered during intensive care. And so that's really important. And so the lungs are one of the last things to develop, as it turns out, in fetal development. And so I want to talk about gas exchange. So again, over here is where the oxygen is, and where it's going is into the blood right there. And then carbon dioxide is going from the capillary into the alveolus air sac. And so gases diffuse from an area of high concentration to low, or you can consider high pressure to low pressure. So that's a mechanism which is pushing the air as well, pressure. And so I thought I'd include this picture as well. This is one of those macrophages, which is reaching out with its fluid membrane, sort of like little tentacles. Sometimes they used to be referred to as pseudopodia, or false feet, where they go out and hook the bacteria and bring it in through endocytosis, and then ultimately they're destroyed by the white blood cell's lysosome. So pretty cool. So here it is. Here's the air sac, and here's a capillary that happens to be cruising by, and here's these little red balls are representing oxygen. And what you can see here is that the oxygen is traveling from high pressure in the alveolar air sac, high concentration, and it's going to diffuse into the capillary. In particular, it's going to be picked up by the hemoglobin, which is a protein found in red blood cells that I want to talk a little bit about shortly. So the oxygen is going in, and it's coloring the blood red, because when oxygen interacts with hemoglobin, there's an iron in the middle of that protein, and therefore it turns sort of a rusty color red, and so you know that it's highly oxygenated. And then this is a big segue right here, but ultimately when it travels back out of the lungs and somewhere in the body, it's going to then offload its oxygen. And so oxygen is going to then enter into the tissue where it's deficient, because the tissues are consuming it. And then the carbon dioxide would then flow back into the blood. And then that's how that's working. Okay? And so basically what I want to get, the main point of this is that the blood is the transportation system for the gases in our body. So red blood cells are carrying oxygen, but they're also carrying a little bit of carbon dioxide, and then carbon dioxide's mostly traveling in the plasma. And so this is what's transporting gases in the body. So one of the main functions of blood is to transport gases, and oxygen is so important to every cell in the body. It's simply incredible. And so just to throw out some numbers, so you can understand, I have a tendency to say, oh, this is very interesting, or this is very important, but let me just throw some numbers out and you can be the judge. So these red blood cells that I'm pointing at right here, okay, do you see that? There's approximately 20 trillion of these cells in the body. So that makes up about 25% of the total cells of the entire body, these red blood cells. This is what we're talking about in terms of significance of carrying these gases. It's amazingly important. And not only that the protein inside the red blood cell, hemoglobin, are you ready for this? Inside each of the red blood cells, okay, let me just pull one of them out right here. Inside each of the red blood cells, there's approximately 270 million molecules of hemoglobin. That's a lot of protein per red blood cell. And as a result of it, the red blood cell, when it's fully developing inside the bone, in the red marrow, it jettisons its nucleus after it's created all that protein so that it has even more space to carry it. And the cell itself is kind of flat and made up of simple squamous so that it maximizes its ability to offload the oxygen. And so think about it. 270 million molecules of protein per cell, 20 trillion cells. That's a lot of hemoglobin. That's telling you it's pretty important. And so here's a picture of that red blood cell. And what's interesting is that it's concave right there, and it's biconcave, so the other side of it is concave as well. And so this shape gives it the ability to carry the maximum amount of hemoglobin, but also be thin enough for exchange to take place most efficiently. It's a beautiful structure, and it really lends itself to its functionality, which is picking up and offshooting oxygen and carbon dioxide. And so 98% of the oxygen carried in our blood is carried by the hemoglobin inside red blood cells. The other 2% could be dissolved in the plasma itself, but as it turns out, water isn't the best solution for carrying oxygen. So dissolved oxygen isn't great. So hemoglobin is really good at picking up oxygen. And you're like, really? Why is that? Well, it's because hemoglobin itself is made up of 4 polypeptide chains. And so it's referred to as a quaternary structure when there's more than one polypeptide. And so you can see them colored here in 4 different chains. There's 4 little heme groups, and that's what this is right there, this structure. I'll show you a picture in detail in a second. Notice how it's red. It's red when oxygen is attached to it. And so oxygen is going to attach there and there and there and there. So it can hold on, each one can hold on to 4 molecules of oxygen. So it's called a globin because of the protein. So the protein is considered to be the globin, and the heme part is considered to be this ring structure, which I'll show you in a second. And when it's bound to oxygen, it's called oxyhemoglobin, and that's what gives it its red color when it's oxyhemoglobin. Therefore, it colors the whole cell red. So here is the 4 chains of protein involved in hemoglobin, and this structure right there is the heme, so the globin and the heme. And so if you look over here in this picture, this is a close-up of the heme group. Now the heme, for those biochemists out there in the crowd, you might recognize the fact that this circular ring of carbon with this nitrogen group looks a lot as a perforin group, which is in chlorophyll, which is the green pigment in plants. There's a magnesium in the center right there, which is then getting its electrons excited in photosynthesis. But instead, in our red blood cells, there's an iron, or Fe. And so it's very important to eat iron in our diet so that our red blood cells can have lots of iron to carry lots of oxygen. Okay? And so check this out. We have this iron, and when it binds to oxygen, right there, it's going to become oxyhemoglobin. Now, there's some interesting things that I wanted to mention about the binding of oxygen. And so what's fascinating about this is that when one oxygen, this is, a little bit of a detail, but I think it's kind of interesting. When one oxygen binds to the heme group, remember I said that 4 can bind? It causes a conformational change in the molecule, which makes the additional oxygens even easier to attach. So one attaches, and then the other one attaches, and then the other one attaches. And so what I'm going to call this, cooperative, right here, cooperative binding. And cooperative binding is really cool because when one binds, the other ones are more likely to bind to the hemoglobin. And so it's sort of like, one person gets on, then the other ones can get on a little bit more easily. And that's kind of interesting. And so you're like, well, why do you bring it up? Because I'm going to relate this to how oxygen is then delivered to like tissue, like for example, in your muscle when you're running. You have to think that the red blood cell is going to want to offshoot the oxygen as well. And so it's sort of the opposite effect of the cooperative binding. So in other words, once one takes off, they all take off more quickly. So that's kind of interesting. And so here's a picture here of a capillary. Okay, so one of the things about a capillary, which is the smallest of all blood vessels, it's made up of a simple squamous. And so here's a red blood cell. You know, what's fascinating is the way I drew this, the red blood cell is actually slightly larger than the diameter of a capillary. And you might be thinking, well, how can that be? Well, it has to literally like squeeze through. And some people believe that when the red blood cell squeezes through the capillary, that also assists in the offshoot of oxygen as well. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about how oxygen, let's go with the red here. So oxygen right here, which is inside the hemoglobin. Okay, so this is attached to hemoglobin. Now, this is going to then be released, and it's going to travel into the tissue. Now, why does the tissue need oxygen? Because the mitochondria is going to use that oxygen to burn fuels, principally glucose and fatty acids for energy. Because you may know that the mitochondria produces a lot of adenosine triphosphate, and in so doing, it produces, as a consequence, lots of carbon dioxide. So let's talk about carbon dioxide for a moment, okay? Let's say carbon dioxide is being produced right here by the mitochondria, and it's being produced by this mitochondria as well. So what happens is carbon dioxide will diffuse into the blood right there. Now, the plasma has a lot of water, okay? So what's going to happen is carbon dioxide can actually, a small amount of it can actually dissolve into the water, and it'll be carried just like that in solution. But also what can happen is the carbon dioxide can then travel into the red blood cell. Okay, there's water inside the red blood cell as well. And so let me write this out. When carbon dioxide reacts with water, and again, you could do this by simply taking a straw and blowing bubbles into water. What happens is that there's a chemical reaction inside the red blood cell, like this. And it's going to produce carbon dioxide and water is going to produce something called carbonic acid. And I'll write that out. It's H2CO3. And let me write that out. Carbonic acid. Carbonic acid. That's right. And so the reason that this is called carbonic acid is because it has the ability to be an acid, which means to donate its hydrogen ions in solution. And so carbonic acid can, let me get rid of the name of it here so I can get a little bit more space. So this is carbonic acid. Okay, so what's going to happen with carbonic acid is that it's going to dissociate into what's known as bicarbonate ion. And so that's HCO3 minus and a proton. Okay, that's why this is called carbonic acid, because it's increasing the acidity right here. And so as it turns out, bicarbonate ion can then travel in the plasma. And so this is the majority of how carbon dioxide is carried in the blood, is bicarbonate ions. Okay? Now, as a little side note, just since we're having the conversation, there's an enzyme inside the red blood cell right here that actually speeds up the production of carbonic acid. It's called carbonic anhydrase. I'll write it out. Carbonic, right here, anhydrase. Anhydrase. And so this enzyme, which is also a protein, speeds this process up, the conversion of carbonic acid. And then carbonic acid dissociates into bicarbonate ion. And so what's really interesting about this is that I mentioned that when a red blood cell, and let me draw another one because I don't want to erase this. When a red blood cell over here, make it like this. When a red blood cell gets to actively exercising muscle, for example, and you're like, gee, I really hope I really hope the red blood cell knows to drop off its oxygen to the muscle because it can really use it. Well, here's the thing. I just don't think the red blood cell knows where it is as it's traveling through the body. So here's the kicker. So I mentioned that hemoglobin, okay, let me draw it out like this. Hemoglobin's holding on to oxygen, okay, and there's 4 of them like that. And so as it turns out, this is what's kind of interesting. I mentioned that bicarbonate ion right here is being produced, but do you notice here, let me emphasize it, I'll make it blue over here. Do you notice how those protons are also being produced when there's a lot of carbon dioxide being generated? So it's kind of acidic. In the capillary, it's kind of acidic in the capillary of an exercising area. So there's a lot of CO2. How do you like this? So if cells are producing a lot of CO2, those are the same cells that are going to want to get a lot of oxygen, right? So what happens is the hydrogen ion, which is positively charged, ready for this? It attaches to hemoglobin. Okay, so these positive ions start attaching to hemoglobin, and what they can do is when they attach to it, they don't attach to the heme group, but to other places on the protein. But when something that's positively charged attaches to a protein, we can call this called allosteric, which means other site, allosteric inhibition, okay? And so what's going to happen is allosteric inhibition is usually, if you've been studying biochemistry, you'll know that allosteric inhibition is sometimes discussed when the end product of a biochemical pathway binds to an enzyme and it temporarily changes its shape, therefore rendering it not as efficient. So what happens is when the protons attach to the hemoglobin, what that's going to do is alter the shape of the molecule, and it's going to allow the oxygen to pop off. And when one oxygen pops off, the other ones pop really quickly, because it's sort of the opposite of the cooperative binding that I was talking about before. So it's really cool. Once one comes off, then the protein starts changing its shape and the other ones come flying off. So right at the, it's kind of brilliant. Right at the point where you want oxygen to go into the cells, the reason that the red blood cell is really giving it up is because the CO2 is coming out of the tissue, which is causing that to occur. And so not only that is, okay, so hemoglobin itself is being altered by the hydrogen, but are you ready for this? Hemoglobin can also carry carbon dioxide. And so when the carbon dioxide is coming out of the tissue, it can bind to the hemoglobin. It doesn't compete with oxygen. It doesn't bind with the heme group, but it binds to the globin part. And so again, the carbon dioxide causes the oxygen to pop off that way. And so that's pretty cool, I think. Okay, and so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about carbon dioxide transport. And so carbon dioxide, there's a little review here, can be dissolved in the plasma in the form of a bicarbonate ion. And so bicarbonate ion is this, okay, a bicarbonate ion. And so the bicarbonate ion, which is basically HO3 minus, like this, is how the majority of your carbon dioxide is being carried in the blood, so 85%. As I was mentioning just a moment ago, carbon dioxide can actually bind with the hemoglobin in red blood cells. So about 10% of carbon dioxide is carried by red blood cells. I'm not sure if everyone knew that. So it's called carbamino hemoglobin. So it's the carbamino hemoglobin that actually causes the oxygen to disassociate with the hemoglobin, because it causes a quickness in the cooperative binding release. And so it allosterically influences the release of oxygen. And then about 5% is simply dissolved in the plasma. So most of the most of the CO2 is in bicarbonate, and so and then some is carried by the carbaminohemoglobin. So the carbaminohemoglobin is in the red blood cell, but so is the carbonic anhydrase, which is the one that is speeding up the production of carbonic acid and then into bicarbonate, even though the bicarbonate travels in the plasma. So here's actually a cool picture of the carbonic anhydrase right there. And so a little picture of what I was trying to draw earlier. When the CO2 comes out of the cells, it either binds with hemoglobin itself, so carbaminohemoglobin, okay, or it goes in, it reacts with oxygen with the help of carbonic anhydrase, which is located inside the red blood cell. So that enzyme's inside the red blood cell. So that speeds up the production of carbonic acid, which then dissociates into bicarbonate ion. And there is how 85% of your CO2 is traveling in your body in bicarbonate ion in the plasma. And so I mentioned before that carbaminohemoglobin helps oxygen to then leave hemoglobin and go in here. And I also mentioned how the hydrogen attaches to hemoglobin, which causes the oxygen to travel inside the tissue as well, which is pretty awesome. Okay, so to review this, CO2 with water with the help of carbonic anhydrase ultimately will produce carbonic acid. Now this will happen irregardless of whether or not you have the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, but it's just sped up that way, which is really important, and because you want that to be quick. And so here you have it. Carbonic acid then dissociates into bicarbonate ion, and I shall also write a proton. And then how about this? When it reaches the lungs, okay, so now we're going to offshoot it. So what happens is the CO2, so it's the opposite. The bicarbonate ion then comes back into the red blood cell, okay? Then it reacts with the proton. It becomes carbonic acid, and then the same enzymes can speed up the conversion back to gaseous CO2, which then diffuses out of the red blood cells and then into the alveolar air sac, and then we exhalate the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Pretty awesome, especially when you can trace this all the way back. Again, you biochemists out there, you can trace that carbon dioxide all the way back into the cell mitochondrial matrix in the Krebs cycle. Pretty awesome. And so here you have it. Here's the tissue, and it's producing a lot of carbon dioxide because the cell's respiring, and the Krebs cycle's producing this, and the CO2 combines with hemoglobin to produce carbaminohemoglobin, which is just a little bit of how CO2 is traveling in red blood cells. But again, it's very important. Helps to knock the oxygen off allosterically. And then over here, you can see how CO2 ultimately forms carbonic acid, and it travels in the bloodstream in the form of bicarbonate ion. And so that's pretty neat. You know, red blood cells, most people think of red blood cells as carrying oxygen, as I mentioned, the oxyhemoglobin, but they can also carry a little bit of carbon dioxide. And you know what's a little scary is that they can also carry carbon monoxide. How do you like that? CO, carbon monoxide. And you probably know that this is a toxic gas. And if this is a brutal thing, if there's a high concentration of CO, the red blood cell, the hemoglobin, actually prefers carbon monoxide over oxygen. And so that would be competitively inhibiting the oxygen binding, and so therefore the red blood cell would not be carrying oxygen, therefore there would not be oxygen to the cells, no ATP, and then we'd die as a result of carbon monoxide inhalation. And so that's just a real shout out to make sure that you have your carbon monoxide sensitive meter in your house to make sure that you're not breathing in too much CO2. And so let me just back it out just a second just to show you what's going on here. So here's your right lung, and here's your left lung over here. And so when Deoxygenated blood travels into the lungs and the alveolar air sacs, which are not shown in here. That's where all the oxygen is being picked up. Okay, it's being picked up by the oxyhemoglobin, and so it's traveling back right here. Let me help illustrate this. So it's traveling like this from the lung to the heart, and so anything going toward the heart is a vein. Okay, so then it's traveling, it's red because it's oxygenated. It's going to travel to the left side of the heart. And so this chamber that it's received is called the left atrium right here. So this is oxygenated blood coming right here. So this is a pulmonary, from the lungs, pulmonary vein right in here. Now, that oxygenated blood that will then travel through that valve into the left ventricle, and the left ventricle will pump it through the whole body. Now, any blood vessel going away from the heart is an artery. So the largest artery of the body is the aorta. So here it is going up to the brain or going down to the rest of the body. So let me go up to the brain. So this is a big blood vessel. There's no gas exchange in blood vessels other than capillaries because those are thin. And so what happens is the oxygen is offloaded into the brain because the neuron needs a lot of oxygen in order to produce energy so that it can think. Okay? And then the CO2 from the brain gets traveling here in the blood. Okay, so as we mentioned, bicarbonate ion, so lots of bicarbonate ions right here. So this is going toward the heart. So this is a vein. So it's coming in like there, and it's coming from above. So it's the superior vena cava. It goes into the right atrium and then into the right ventricle. And the right ventricle is going to pump it in what's called the pulmonary artery. And it's going to travel to the lung to get its oxygen and then come back. So do you see here that there's two circuits? There's one circuit where the heart is pumping to the lungs. This is called the pulmonary circuit, like that. And then there's another circuit where the heart is pumping to the body and then coming back to the heart. The body and coming back to the heart. So when it's going away from the heart, it's either going to the lungs or it's going to the body. Okay? And so this isn't really a video discussing the cardiovascular system, but I thought I'd, throw it in here just because. And so ultimately, what's happening in the air sac is the CO2, once it leaves the red blood cell, or when bicarbonate ion is converted back to carbonic acid, and then carbonic acid gets converted back to CO2. The gas then simply diffuses into the alveolar air sac, and then oxygen is picked up by the red blood cell. So this is where gas exchange occurs across this respiratory membrane, because these cells are very thin. And so again, the point of the heart is to simply provide the pressure so that the cells are moving along. Okay, so that's kind of cool. And the right side of the heart is deoxygenated blood, and the left side is oxygenated blood. So I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned something a little bit about gas exchange in the respiratory system. Thanks for watching.